Edward Thorndike, also known as the father of educational psychology, was born in 1874 in Lowell, Massachusetts, to a Methodist minister and his wife. He would grow up interested in psychology and later attend Harvard to study under William James, whose principles of psychology had inspired Thorndike as a boy. Thorndike would go on to marry Elizabeth Moulton, father 5 children, and conduct groundbreaking research in learning theory. After his time at Harvard, Thorndike transferred to Columbia University, where he earned his PhD in 1898. He spent 1 year at the College for Women of Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, Ohio, but then returned to Columbia University in New York to become a professor of psychology. He remained at Columbia for the rest of his career, where his focus was on the study of learning. Thorndike developed several learning theories, and his name is most commonly associated with connectionism, the idea that learning is a result of connections being made between stimuli and responses. His research that placed an emphasis on consequences of behaviors and their impact on future behaviors opened the door for future psychological research on reinforcement related to learning. Thorndike arguably received more recognition in his day than in the present day, since much of his work is now associated with more modern learning and behavior theorists' extensions of his ideas. In 1912, Thorndike served as president of the American Psychological Association. He also served as president of the American Association for Adult Education from 1934 to 1935. Thorndike received several honorary degrees from universities around the world, such as the University of Chicago, Harvard University, Edinburgh University, and the University of Athens. A prolific researcher and contributor to the growing field of psychology, Edward Thorndike retired in 1939, but he worked in educational and learning research until his death in 1949. Over the course of his career, Thorndike published 508 titles, which amounts to almost 10 each year. Some of Thorndike's contemporaries from the same time period were John Watson and Ivan Pavlov. Thorndike was a pioneer investigator in the field of animal and human learning, and his work in pairing stimuli and responses would blaze the path for later learning and behavioral theorists, most notably B.F. Skinner. Thorndike did his work at a time when the field of psychological research was still very new and had not been commonly linked to educational practices. Thorndike has been recognized as among the first to apply psychological principles to the area of teaching. For these reasons, as stated earlier, Thorndike is often referred to as the father of educational psychology. Much of his work was related to learning, first animals, then adults and children in education. Thorndike's first body of work was related to learning and stimulus response as seen in animals. For Thorndike's doctoral thesis at Columbia, his topic was Animal Intelligence, an experimental study of the associative processes in animals. Thorndike's most famous experiment on animal learning involved a puzzle box for cats. In this experiment, there was a particular way for the cat to remove itself from the box, an unpleasant condition, to gain freedom, a more pleasant consequence. The cat could only free itself by pushing a lever, but initially acted in many ways, such as biting the bars and jumping. Over time, the cat was much more likely to push the lever and escape more quickly because the connection between the stimulus, the lever, and response, opening the door, became established, resulting in a favorable outcome, freedom. How does this experiment relate to learning theory? The idea of a particular course of action resulting in a reward increases the tendency of the subject to perform that action in later trials, as seen in this image. According to Gray, the law of effect states that responses that produce a satisfying effect in a particular situation become more likely to occur again in that situation, and responses that produce a discomforting effect become less likely to occur again in that situation. The law of effect is what Thorndike is most famous for, and is a result of his work with animals. Examples of this law of effect are also readily available in the educational environment. We see the law of effect at work when students respond positively to reinforcers, and when students respond negatively to punishers, and are less likely to act out in the future. B.F. Skinner further explores this phenomenon in his theory of operant conditioning. The law of effect was a qualitative theory of Thorndike's, but he never quantified this theory. Decades after Thorndike's work on the law of effect, another psychologist, R.J. Herrnstein, proposed a mathematical formula to represent the law of effect. Herrnstein quantified the positive relationship between response rate and reinforcement rate, something that Thorndike had illustrated in his work with animals. Thorndike's law of effect is part of a bigger theory called connectionism. According to Kearsley in 2011, connectionism represents the original SR, stimulus response, framework of behavioral psychology. Learning is the result of associations forming between stimuli and responses. Such associations or habits become strengthened or weakened by the nature and frequency of the SR pairings. The paradigm for SR theory was trial and error learning, in which certain responses come to dominate others due to rewards. And the hallmark of connectionism, like all behavioral theory, was that learning could be adequately explained without referring to any unobservable internal states. Connectionism can be divided into three main parts or ideas, the first being the law of effect, and the other two being the laws of readiness and exercise. The law of readiness states that responses in a series can be chained together to satisfy a goal if the responses belong to the same action sequence. In terms of Thorndike's cat experiment, this was seen in the fact that the cat's actions formed a single sequence to escape from the box. The law of exercise states that learning requires practice or repetition of a connection. In terms of Thorndike's puzzle box experiment, the cat was able to escape more quickly not only due to the reward of freedom, but the continued practice of multiple trials of pushing the lever. This can easily be related to educational practices today and the use of drilling procedures in the development of fluency. While Thorndike's learning theory has many strengths in that it was one of the first that attempted to explain learning in humans and can be applied to a variety of educational situations, there are weaknesses also associated with Thorndike's early research. For example, like other strict behavioral principles, Thorndike's theory implies that all actions are a result of responses to stimuli and that learning cannot be traced back to internal, unobservable processes in the brain or mind. As was hinted at earlier, Thorndike had many connections and similarities to other psychologists, both of his time and after. Thorndike worked under James McKeen Cattell, a famous intelligence theorist, while earning his PhD at Columbia. Part of Thorndike's learning theory does focus on intelligence and the idea that intelligence is a function or result of the number of connections learned by a person. Thorndike went on to study intelligence and designed psychometric tests to measure intelligence, much like Cattell. Another one of Thorndike's contemporaries, and one of the most well-known psychologists in history, was Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov, like Thorndike, worked with animals to investigate the process of stimulus and response connection. Pavlov's work, while it examined different stimuli and response relationships, was similar to Thorndike's work in that it examined connections made between the two and how such connections were made. Finally, somebody commonly associated with Thorndike and often given credit for many of Thorndike's ideas about stimulus-response relationships is B.F. Skinner. Thorndike's work inspired much of Skinner's work in behaviorism in the later part of the 20th century. Skinner took the ideas from Thorndike's law of effect and other research a step further in a more radical way. His work focused on how certain responses to stimuli may be reinforcing for an individual, increasing the likelihood of a behavior. He had research on rate of responding and operant conditioning based on the idea of reinforcement. There are several past and current applications of connectionism and Thorndike's learning theory, and there will surely be advances made in the future using behavioral principles to further enhance classroom practices. In his time, Thorndike's learning theory was called upon to implement certain practices based on his research in order to make classroom teaching more efficient and effective. Thorndike's law of effect can easily be tied to rewards and punishments, both strategies that had been around for many years before the research was conducted. Thorndike's laws of readiness and exercise are still evident in classrooms today. We teach children how to perform certain actions in sequences for a particular outcome, and we encourage students to practice newly acquired skills. In accordance with the law of effect, teachers still emphasize positive outcomes in order to encourage students' hard work and good study habits. Thorndike is known as the father of educational psychology for a good reason. His ideas paved the way for the behavioral principles commonly used in classrooms, both to manage behavior and to encourage academic success. He was one of the first to apply such psychological principles to the field of education, a practice that has changed the outcomes of many students and a practice that keeps evolving, even today.